there is a feeling, or in the mainstream Western press, that China is turning left. And that would be very, very difficult for the market forces as well as investors. There are a couple of things which I'd like to add here. First and foremost, it's no longer a question of China, Europe, and the United States. It's now the rising of the global South. The developing countries are no longer what previously just became independent countries that they were. They have become much more active. They've grown a lot, and the social media has provided the population with tremendous information flow. They've become much more sophisticated in terms of handling of global affairs. And we see this not only in Asia with ASEAN countries, but also in South America and Africa, where Africa now does its banking on the cell phone, which is more advanced than many parts of America, by the way. So I think we have to look more than the tripartite that Professor Ding talked about, but also to include the multilateral forces which are being promoted and being actively pursued by China and the developing South. And the South-South collaboration will become that much more important going forward, because you see already the biggest trading partner of China this year is ASEAN. It's no longer the EU. Last year it was the EU, but today it's the ASEAN countries. And the GDP of the ASEAN countries has gone over $3 trillion. So I think on the geopolitical side, one has to take those factors into account and look carefully at how their interests are covered. For example, there have been attempts to promote the adding of G20 by a 21st party, namely the African Union. If you can have the EU as a participant, why not the African Union as well? So I think Europe has to look beyond China and the United States and also look at the global South. Now, in terms of the meeting with whether or not had taken place in Bali between President Xi and Mrs. van der Leyen, I think the impression in Beijing, sitting here in Beijing, has been that the EU, in her case, in particular, has been very anti-China and has been very negative and has been filling, every time when China is mentioned, has been filling the press with anti-China statements. And so I'm not sure whether or not that's the reason why those meetings were held in Bali, even though President Xi met with 12 heads of state from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe. Okay, now, I would like to comment on something which wasn't talked about, but which was a question that was addressed to me. And namely, it was whether or not private companies and private capital in China are going to be hit by new policies after the 20th Party Congress. There is a feeling, or in the mainstream Western press, that China is turning left. And that would be very, very difficult for the market forces as well as investors. I've been an investor in China for 30 years, so I watched this whole process. I think in terms of the private sector development, there isn't really, as Professor Ding said, a watershed change. What we have had is a fairly consistent policy, but also must address new problems that arise and address them effectively. For example, private capital has become very, very powerful in China. Very large monopolistic companies have dominated several sectors, including e-commerce, including small-scale loans, private lending, and so on and so forth, filling a void where the state-owned companies do not perform. Now, as these grow very, very large, they have to become regulated in one way or another through various Chinese government mechanisms. This is not anti-market. Anti-market is the CHIPS Act of the US and the sanctions and the blockade of Chinese technology companies. That's anti-market. But to provide regulations on anti-monopolistic practices and so on happened in the US more than 100 years ago. So it's not going left, but it is just regulating forces which have become very, very powerful in the economy, and some might have become too powerful and become monopolistic. Second, in terms of private capital, I think one has to be very to be well aware of what the government's next phase of development will focus on after alleviating absolute poverty, as Professor Ding said. After alleviating absolute poverty, the next phase is to increase the income of the middle income group and enlarge the middle income group. And in the Chinese case, it's called common prosperity. I don't think anyone would be satisfied with a country that has, for example, in the US today, over 500,000 homeless who live on the street. Meanwhile, you have people worth hundreds of billions of dollars, enough to run for 20 generations. So common prosperity is something that the Chinese government is aiming to do. And in that context, I think the Chinese government has also been cited on by some in the Western media as going leftward. But we don't see increasing regulation of new sectors, of new circumstances, of new developments, and common prosperity to create value and wealth for society as a whole as going left. Now, as for Europe, I think Europe has to understand also that its choice is as follows. China is actually part of the rising Asia. ASEAN countries, when pressured by the United States, chose not to take sides. Why? Because their economies, while integrating into the supply chain of China, have benefited tremendously and has brought about significant growth in terms of wealth to its own population, as well as really enhanced GDP growth for all the ASEAN countries. So I would call the situation over the course of the last 2 decades as the rise of Asia with Chinese market at its core. I think Europe has to look at that as a comprehensive whole, and not just China, but hopefully China and Asia, and participate in its supply chain and its growing market. In fact, there was a study in the US that for the next 5 years, 82% of new entries into the middle class will be in Asia. So market size becomes really, really very, very significant. I know I'm jumping from subject to subject. It's because I've heard the previous speakers cover so many of the very important factors already. As for China next 5 years, 10 years, I'm really very anxious to have Europe collaborate with China on new renewable sources of energy, because China is probably the most significant country in that today. I think more than 35% of the global solar power generation is in China today, and 80% of the manufacturing capacity for solar panels is in China today. as well as wind power. There should be much better collaboration in new renewable sources of energy. I think also in electric vehicles. Instead of the US looking at high-powered big engines that burn fossil fuels, Europeans are probably much more conducive to accept using electric vehicles, which has much lower carbon emission. And in terms of Europe standing with the US, unfortunately, whenever the US asked, especially in the last 2 years, Europe to stand with the US and take sides, Europe has done so against China in the Chinese continent. Maybe some not enthusiastically, not wholeheartedly, but every time the US attacks China on human rights, on technology transfer, on many of these issues, the Europeans have taken sides. At the same time, we don't see the global South taking sides against China, despite tremendous pressure by the US. So I'm hoping that desperately that Europe would be more independent and be more objective about China. All it wants to do is to improve the lives of these people. All it wants to do is to promote further sustainable growth. China has not invaded anyone, has not put military bases all over the world. Why should China be subject to the type of pressure and sanctions and humiliation by US? That's all for now.